The spring of 1983 arrived late in southern Illinois. Harold Brennan stood in the doorway of his implement dealership on a Tuesday morning, watching the rain come down in sheets across the empty lot. Inside, 27 pieces of green and yellow machinery sat silent under the fluorescent lights. Outside, the sign read, "Brennan John Deere, established 1968. Harold was 51 years old that year, and he had never seen farmers so afraid to spend money. The previous harvest had been decent enough. Corn prices had held around $3 a bushel through most of '82. But now in early '83, something had shifted in the countryside. The Federal Reserve, under Paul Volcker's direction, had pushed interest rates to levels nobody had imagined possible. Prime rate had touched 21% just 2 years earlier. Farm loans that had seemed manageable at 8 or 9% were now crushing families who had borrowed against inflated land values. Harold knew the numbers because he saw them every day. A farmer who bought a $100,000 combine in 1979 was now paying nearly $15,000 a year just in interest. Land that had sold for $3,000 an acre in 1980 was suddenly worth half that, maybe less. Harold had worked as a salesman for John Deere dealers since 1962. He opened his own dealership in a town called Carterville, population around 3,000, after saving for 6 years. He understood machinery the way some men understand livestock. He could walk around a tractor and tell you what needed attention just by listening to the engine idle. He knew torque specifications, hydraulic pressures, gear ratios, but more than that, he understood the men who bought from him. These were people who rose before dawn, worked until dark, and measured their success not in quarterly reports, but in yields per acre, and the condition of their soil when they passed it to their sons. On that Tuesday in March of '83, a man named Robert Castellano walked into the dealership just after 10 in the morning. Robert farmed 800 acres about 12 miles east of Carterville, near a crossroads called Spillertown. He was 34 years old, married, with 2 daughters in elementary school. His father had farmed the same land before him, though it had been just 400 acres then. Robert had expanded in the late '70s, buying the adjacent property when his neighbor retired. He paid $2,800 an acre in 1979, financing 80% of it through the local farm credit office. At the time, everyone told him it was a smart move. Land prices were climbing 15, sometimes 20% a year. Corn was strong. Soybeans were strong. The experts on the radio said American agriculture was entering a golden age, feeding a hungry world. Robert stood just inside the door, shaking rain off his jacket. Harold recognized him immediately. They had done business twice before. A 4-wheel drive tractor in '79, a grain drill in '81. Both times Robert had been decisive, clear about what he needed, and he paid on time. Harold walked over and shook his hand. They talked about the weather for a moment, about planting schedules, about whether the ground would be dry enough by mid-April. Then Robert said he needed to look at combines. Harold nodded slowly. He had a 7600 model on the floor, one of the biggest in the line. 12-row corn head, fully equipped cab, low hours on a trade-in. The price tag said $89,000. Robert walked around it, ran his hand along the feeder house, climbed up into the cab. He sat there for a long time, not saying anything. Harold stood below, waiting. He had learned decades ago that silence was often the best sales technique. Let a man think. Let him imagine himself in that seat, moving through his fields, watching grain pour into the hopper. When Robert climbed down, he looked tired. He said his current combine was a 1974 model, bought used. It still ran, but it was slow. The corn head was only 6 rows. In a good year, he could barely finish harvest before the weather turned. With 800 acres, he needed more capacity. He needed to get in and out of the fields faster, especially now that he was farming more ground than his father ever had. Harold understood. He had heard the same story from dozens of farmers. The mathematics of scale were unforgiving. You either expanded and bought bigger equipment, or you stayed small and fell behind. The middle ground was disappearing. But Robert did not make an offer that day. He thanked Harold for his time and drove back to his farm. Harold watched him go, knowing what the hesitation meant. It was not about the machine. It was about the debt. It was about looking at the numbers late at night and wondering if you could survive another year of 14% interest on money you had borrowed when interest was 7. 2 weeks passed. Harold sold a used planter to a farmer from Heron and a pull-type sprayer to a young man just starting out on rented ground. But the big equipment, the combines and four-wheel drive tractors, sat untouched. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, Robert came back. He parked his truck in front of the dealership and walked inside carrying a folder full of papers. He looked like he had not slept well. He told Harold he wanted to talk numbers. They sat in Harold's office, a small room in the back with a metal desk, 2 chairs, and a calendar from a hydraulic hose supplier on the wall. Robert laid out his situation. He owed $112,000 on the land he had bought in '79. The interest rate had adjusted upward twice. He was now paying 13.5%. His annual payment, just on the land, was over $15,000. He had another $18,000 in equipment debt, a operating loan of $32,000, and a line of credit he had tapped for seed and chemicals. His total debt service was roughly $73,000 a year. If he had an average yield, say 130 bushels per acre on corn and 40 on beans, and if prices held near $3 for corn and 7 for beans, he could generate around $260,000 in gross revenue. After input costs, fuel, repairs, insurance, and his debt payments, he would clear maybe $20,000. That was before he paid himself anything, before he bought groceries or fixed the roof on his house or saved for his daughter's education. Harold listened without interrupting. He had seen these spreadsheets before, in different handwriting but with the same brutal arithmetic. Robert said he could not afford the combine, not at $89,000, not with financing that would run another 12 or 13%. It would bury him. But he also could not afford to keep running the old machine. He was losing time in the field, losing yield to weather delays, losing the ability to take advantage of narrow harvest windows when conditions were right. He was trapped between 2 kinds of failure. Harold sat back in his chair. He thought for a moment, then asked Robert a question. He asked him how much cash he could put down. Robert said he had $8,000 in a savings account. It was supposed to be emergency money, but he was willing to use it. Harold nodded. Then he asked Robert what he thought the old combine was worth. Robert said maybe $12,000 if he could find a buyer. It was old, but it still worked. Harold wrote some numbers on a notepad. Then he made Robert an offer that did not make conventional sense. He said he would sell Robert the 7600 combine for $74,000, a $15,000 reduction from the sticker price. He would take the $8,000 in cash and the old combine as trade, crediting it at $14,000, even though they both knew it was worth less. That left a balance of $52,000. Harold said he would carry the note himself through the dealership at 8% interest for 7 years. No bank involved, no credit committees, just a handshake and a contract between them. Robert stared at him. He asked why. Why would Harold take that kind of risk? Why would he offer terms that undercut every bank in the region? Harold's answer was simple. He said he had watched good farmers go under because of interest rates they could not control and land values they did not create. He said the banks and the farm credit system were pulling back, calling in loans, forcing liquidations. He said someone had to make a different choice, even if it was just one transaction, one farmer, one machine. He also said he believed Robert would pay. He had watched him for 4 years. He knew the kind of man he was. Robert sat there for a long time. Then he stood up and shook Harold's hand. They signed the papers that afternoon. Robert drove the combine home 3 days later. Harold filed the contract in his cabinet and did not tell his accountant what he had done until a month later, when the man noticed the receivable on the books. The accountant told him he was insane. Harold said maybe, but the deal was done. The summer of '83 was hot and dry. Robert planted early and watched his corn struggle through June. By July, the leaves were curling in the afternoon heat. Rain came in short bursts, never enough to soak deep into the soil. The markets were soft. Corn dropped below $3, then below $2.80. The newspapers were full of stories about farm foreclosures, equipment auctions, families leaving land that had been in their names for 100 years. Robert worked his fields with the kind of quiet determination that comes from having no other option. He cultivated, He sprayed. He prayed for rain that mostly did not come. But when harvest arrived in late September, the new combine made a difference. Robert could cover 40 acres a day, sometimes more, moving through his rows with a speed and efficiency that his old machine never had. He finished his corn in 12 days. His soybeans took another 8. The yield was not great, down maybe 15% from a normal year, but he got it all in before the weather turned. He sold enough at harvest to cover his immediate bills, then stored the rest, hoping prices would improve by spring. When he wrote his first payment to Harold in December, the check was for $870. It cleared 3 days later. 1984 was worse. The drought continued through the summer. Corn prices dropped to $2.40. Soybeans fell to $5.80. The newspaper in Marion reported that 37 farms in the county had gone to auction that year. Robert's neighbors, men he had known since childhood, were selling out. Some moved to town and found work in factories or warehouses. Some just disappeared, leaving behind empty houses and overgrown fields. Robert kept farming. He cut every expense he could. He stopped buying new clothes. He and his wife grew a bigger garden. His daughters wore hand-me-downs. He repaired equipment himself, late into the night, rather than paying a mechanic. And every month he made his payment to Harold. Harold, meanwhile, was struggling in his own way. Dealership sales had collapsed. In 1979, he had sold 42 pieces of major equipment. In '84, he sold 11. His parts and service department kept the business alive, but barely. He laid off 2 employees. He stopped taking a salary for himself, living off savings and his wife's income from her job at the county health department. He thought about closing, thought about selling the inventory and the property and walking away. But he had farmers like Robert who depended on him for parts, for service, for advice. And he had that $52,000 note sitting in his files, a bet he had made on a man's character in the middle of a collapsing farm economy. The payments kept coming, every month, sometimes early, sometimes on the last day, but they came. $870. Harold deposited each check and marked it in his ledger. He never called Robert to ask how things were going. He figured if the checks stopped, he would know things had gone bad. But they did not stop. 1985 brought some relief. Rain returned. Corn prices edged back toward $3. Robert had his best yield in 4 years, 142 bushels per acre. He sold at harvest and again in the spring of '86, catching a small rally in the futures market. He paid down some of his operating debt. He bought his daughters new winter coats. He told his wife that maybe, just maybe, they were going to make it. By 1987, the crisis was easing. Interest rates had come down. Land prices had stabilized, though they never returned to the highs of 1980. The farmers who had survived were leaner, tougher, more cautious. They had learned to live with less debt, to save more, to avoid the trap of borrowing against optimism. Robert was one of them. He still farmed his 800 acres, still ran the combine Harold had sold him, still made his payments every month. In the spring of 1990, Robert made his final payment. 7 years, 84 checks, not a single one late. Harold sent him the title, free and clear, with a handwritten note that said, "Congratulations." Robert called him that afternoon to say thank you. They talked for a few minutes about the weather, about the upcoming planting season, about how things had changed since '83. Then Robert said something that Harold did not expect. He said he wanted to buy Harold dinner, to sit down and talk, not about business, but just to visit. Harold agreed. They met at a steakhouse in Marion on a Saturday evening. Robert brought his wife. Harold brought his. They ordered ribeyes and baked potatoes and talked about their families, their kids, their plans. Robert's daughters were in high school now, both good students, both thinking about college. Harold's son was working as an engineer in St. Louis. They talked about the farm crisis, about the people they had known who did not make it, about how close it had all come to ending differently. Robert told Harold that the combine had been the difference. It had given him the capacity to farm efficiently, to get his crops out on time, to compete with bigger operations. But more than that, the terms Harold had offered had given him breathing room. The 8% interest had saved him maybe $4,000 a year compared to what a bank would have charged. Over 7 years, that was nearly $30,000. It was the margin between survival and liquidation. Harold listened and said he was glad it had worked out. He said he had taken a risk, but it was a calculated one. He had believed in Robert, and Robert had proven him right. They finished their meal and shook hands in the parking lot. Harold thought that would be the end of it, a good memory, a reminder that decency and trust still mattered even in hard times. But 18 years later, in the fall of 2008, Harold received a letter. He was 69 years old by then, retired from the dealership, living in a small house on the edge of Carterville. His wife had passed away 3 years earlier. His son visited when he could, but Harold spent most of his days alone, reading, working in his garden, driving into town for coffee at the diner. The letter was from Robert. It was handwritten, 2 pages, careful and deliberate. Robert explained that he was writing to tell Harold something he had never said directly. He said that the decision Harold made in 1983 had changed his life. It had allowed him to keep his farm, to raise his daughters in the place he loved, to build something that would last. His daughters had both gone to college. One was a teacher now, the other a nurse. His farm was paid off. He had cattle and hogs in addition to row crops. He was 60 years old, healthy, and still working the land every day. Robert wrote that he had thought about Harold often over the years, about the kindness and the faith he had shown when faith was in short supply. He said he had tried to pass that same spirit on to his own daughters, to teach them that integrity and trust were not old-fashioned ideas but the foundation of any life worth living. He said he wanted to give Harold something, not as repayment, because the debt had been paid long ago, but as a token of gratitude. He asked Harold to call him. Harold called the next day. They talked for nearly an hour. Robert said he wanted to take Harold on a trip. He had done well in recent years. Corn prices had climbed to $6 a bushel in 2007, then spiked to over $7 in 2008 before the financial crisis hit. He had sold at the right times, saved aggressively, and invested carefully. He had more than he needed. He wanted to take Harold to see the John Deere factory in Waterloo, Iowa. He knew Harold had worked with the equipment his whole life, but had never actually seen where it was made. He wanted to buy the plane tickets, the hotel, the meals, everything. He just wanted Harold to say yes. Harold was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would be honored. They flew to Cedar Rapids in November of 2008. Robert rented a car and they drove to Waterloo, checked into a hotel, and spent the next day touring the tractor assembly plant. They watched massive frames move down the line, saw engines being installed, hydraulics connected, cabs lowered into place. They saw workers in green uniforms, welding, bolting, testing, building the machines that had powered American agriculture for over a century. Harold stood there, watching it all, and felt something he had not felt in years. He felt connected to something larger than himself, part of a continuum of people who had built things, sold things, believed in things. That evening, they had dinner at a quiet restaurant near the hotel. Robert gave Harold a small box, wrapped in plain paper. Inside was a brass plaque, engraved with a simple message. It read, "To Harold Brennan, who believed when belief was hard. With gratitude, Robert Castellano." Harold held it in his hands, reading it twice, then looked up at Robert. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said thank you. They flew home the next day. Harold put the plaque on the mantel in his living room, where it stayed for the rest of his life. He passed away in 2013 at the age of 81. His son found the plaque when he was going through the house, along with a file folder containing the original contract from 1983 and every payment record, all 84 of them, carefully preserved. He called Robert to tell him about his father's death. Robert drove to Carterville for the funeral. He sat in the back of the church and listened as people spoke about Harold's life, his honesty, his generosity, his quiet strength. When it was over, Robert walked up to the casket, placed his hand on it for a moment, and said a silent prayer for the man who had saved his farm. The story of Harold Brennan and Robert Castellano is not unique. Across the Midwest in the 1980s, there were thousands of moments like theirs, small decisions made by individuals who chose to act with compassion when systems were failing. Some of those decisions worked out, many did not, but each one represented a refusal to accept that the only rational response to crisis was to protect yourself and let others fend for themselves. Harold could have said no. He could have pointed Robert to a bank, wished him luck, and moved on to the next customer. No one would have blamed him. The economy was brutal. The risks were real. But Harold made a different choice, and that choice rippled forward through decades, through 2 daughters who went to college, through a farm that survived, through a family that stayed intact. There is a tendency, when we look back at economic crises, to focus on the big forces: the Federal Reserve's interest rate policy, the collapse of land values, the contraction of credit. These things matter. They shape outcomes in ways that individuals cannot control. But within those large forces, there is always room for human agency, for the choices people make about how to treat each other when the world is falling apart. Harold's choice to offer Robert terms that defied market logic was not irrational. It was a bet on character, on reciprocity, on the idea that trust, even in hard times, can be a form of capital that pays returns no ledger can measure. Robert's choice to honor that trust, to make every payment, to sacrifice and struggle rather than default, was not inevitable. He could have walked away. He could have declared bankruptcy, let the combine go back to Harold, and started over. Many farmers did exactly that, not because they were dishonest, but because they were drowning. But Robert kept his word, and in doing so, he validated Harold's faith. The plaque was not just a gift. It was a statement that the transaction between them had been about more than machinery and money. It had been about 2 men recognizing something fundamental in each other and choosing to honor it. The farm crisis of the 1980s reshaped American agriculture in ways that are still visible today. The number of farms declined. The average farm size increased. The surviving operations became more efficient, more mechanized, more dependent on technology and scale. The small farmer, the figure that had once been central to American identity, became rarer. The forces that drove these changes were powerful and largely impersonal. But within that transformation, there were countless individual stories, each one a testament to resilience, or loss, or both. What should we make of this? What lessons, if any, survive the specifics of combines and corn prices and interest rates? Perhaps the simplest is this: in times of crisis, the choices we make about how to treat each other matter more, not less. Systems fail, markets collapse, institutions prove fragile. But the bonds between individuals, when they are rooted in trust and maintained through integrity, can endure. Harold and Robert built something that lasted longer than the machines they traded. They built a relationship based on mutual respect and shared risk, and that relationship became a kind of anchor in a chaotic time. We might also consider the nature of value. Harold's dealership did not maximize profit on that transaction. By any conventional business metric, he left money on the table. But what did he gain? He gained the knowledge that he had helped a good man survive. He gained a friendship that lasted 30 years. He gained a story that his son would tell, that Robert's daughters would remember, that would become part of the fabric of their community. These are not trivial returns. They are, in some ways, the only returns that matter when everything else is stripped away. And what of Robert? He paid a debt, yes, but he also paid forward a kind of faith in the future. By honoring his obligation, he demonstrated to his daughters that promises mean something, that character is measured not in what you say, but in what you do when doing the right thing is difficult. That lesson, internalized by 2 young women who became a teacher and a nurse, has likely influenced dozens or hundreds of other lives in ways that cannot be traced but are nonetheless real. There is a question worth asking as we think about this story. What would have happened if Harold had said no? What would have happened if Robert had defaulted? We cannot know for certain, but we can imagine. Harold's dealership might have survived anyway, or it might have failed slightly later, for slightly different reasons. Robert's farm might have been sold at auction, the land absorbed by a neighbor or a corporate operation, the family relocated to a city somewhere, the daughters still educated, still successful, but shaped by a different narrative. The machinery would have kept running. The crops would still have been planted and harvested by someone. The economic forces would have played out largely the same. But something would have been lost. Some small proof that decency and trust are not just sentimental relics, but viable strategies, even in hard times. Some evidence that the way we treat each other in moments of vulnerability defines us more than the profits we extract or the risks we avoid. The story of Harold and Robert is not a fairy tale. It does not suggest that kindness always wins or that good people never suffer. The farm crisis destroyed thousands of families who were every bit as decent and hardworking as Robert. Harold's dealership barely survived, and many others like it did not. But this story does suggest that when we have the power to choose how we will act, the choice matters. It matters to the people directly involved, and it matters to everyone who hears the story afterward and wonders what they would have done. So what do we do with this? How do we think about trust and obligation in our own time, when the forces that shape our lives feel just as impersonal and overwhelming as they did in 1983? Do we retreat into self-protection, calculating every risk, guarding every asset, assuming that everyone else will do the same? Or do we look for moments where we can make a different choice, where we can extend trust even when it is not guaranteed, honor commitments even when it costs us, act with generosity even when the world seems to reward only calculation? These are not easy questions, and the answers will be different for each of us, shaped by our circumstances, our histories, our capacities. But they are questions worth asking, because the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and how we should live are built, one decision at a time, by ordinary people facing impossible choices and deciding, against all the pressures of the moment, to believe in something better.